So a lot of folks tell you that you should dry brine a thick steak. I know I'm guilty of this. Anytime I have time to dry brine, I almost always dry brine my thick steaks. But why? Does it actually make a difference? And what are some of the pros? And what are things that are just simply untrue? Today, we're going to talk about dry brining thick cuts of steak and how and why they work. So today I have a bone-in 1.5-inch cut of ribeye steak, and it's been dry brining for about 4.5 hours. Some chefs will promise that if you dry brine your steak ahead of time, you're going to get a better steak, a more tender and moist steak. But you're also going to get better browning because the salt is drawing out the moisture. But is that true? So let's look at our steak that was dry brined with salt for over 4 hours. The salt is breaking down the muscle proteins, making the meat more tender. A thick cut of steak like this one requires a lot of time for the salt to actually penetrate all the way through the meat and to its core, to actually make a significant difference in flavor. 4.5 hours is just not enough. So instead, I've generously salted this steak to hit that sweet spot for me. But what's even more evident is that you can clearly see how much moisture is being drawn out to the surface of the steak, and this will definitely aid in browning when searing for that perfect crust. But that's only true if the steak is patted down before searing to remove all that moisture, which I always do ahead of time regardless. This steak has deep, vibrant colors. Let's take a look at the steak that wasn't dry brined and immediately salted just before filming. The coarse kosher salt is still evident at the surface and has not penetrated below it. When compared to the brine steak, you can see a huge difference, not only in the color, but the drawn out moisture. Salt truly does amazing things to food. And if you're interested in learning more, check out this video that I made. So what if you're like me and you like barbecuing your steaks outside? Does salt brining them ahead of time make a difference? I almost always cook thick cuts of steak using the reverse sear method, and you should definitely use the reverse sear method because it's going to give you sous vide like edge to edge doneness, almost replicating it if you do it correctly. Now anytime you cook anything, you're drawing moisture out from the core and bringing it to the surface so it can evaporate. But with the reverse sear method, you're starting on the indirect side, so all that moisture is coming out anyways. Does dry brining it ahead of time help any? Okay, it's time now to put brining through the test, at least for grilling. And this is where things got a bit interesting. We went ahead and reverse seared both steaks on indirect heat. The one with the combustion ink predictive thermometer was the one that was dry brined. And halfway through we flipped them to make sure that we were getting even edge to edge doneness, just like sous vide. Both steaks had moisture oozing out of them, and the thermometers gave basically identical surface temperature readings. And my combustion ink thermometer let me know it was time to start searing. And if I was being honest with you guys, this is where I was expecting a huge difference between the two steaks. But there really wasn't. They were both searing identically. And at this point in the experiment, I also wasn't really noticing a big difference in tenderness or how each steak felt or weighed, or if one steak was softer than the other. Again, to ensure edge-to-edge doneness, I made sure to continuously flip each steak. There wasn't one particular steak that was browning better than the other. So then I thought, okay, there must be a clear winner when it comes to doneness. This is a steak that was brined ahead of time. Cutting through it, it hit my perfect preferred doneness, as the predictive thermometer predicted. Cutting into the steak that was not dry brined, again, it looks identical. And if I didn't tell you which steak was which, you really couldn't tell a difference. Both steaks were incredibly juicy, tender, and perfectly done. So this is a steak that was not brined, just salted and seasoned just like any other steak. So good. And here's a steak that was brined. And it's literally dripping
That's good steak.
Alright, there's definitely a difference. The dry brine steak definitely brought all the flavors forward and enhanced it. It just tasted more steaky.
But if you're like me, and you're going to be adding some finishing touches,
Let's be honest, most of us are going to finish our steaks and we're going to enhance them to take them to another level. I like to finish with Malden sea salt, black pepper, and occasionally I'll make a beef tallow with some herbs and garlic and just smother my steaks with it.
sometimes I love my job. Now that is terrific steak.
There is some caveats that I want to mention. Obviously, the longer that you dry brine your cut of beef, the more intense the effects of dry brining are going to be. So for example, if you dry brine for 6 hours or overnight or a whole day, the steak's going to get more tender, more moisture is going to draw out, but you're also going to have some unintended consequences, like the steak being way too salty. So you have to adjust by not salting as generously as you would if you're only going to salt brine for, let's say, 4 hours, like I do. And that's obviously going to affect how you finish your steak at the end.
So ultimately, I do think there are some benefits to dry brining a thick cut of beef ahead of time. But based on your techniques, and if you're going to finish it off later anyways, with finishing salt, finishing pepper, or whatever, you may or may not notice. Personally, I think dry brining a thick cut of meat ahead of time, if you have the time, are always beneficial. Now, whether or not you see the benefits of it, it's still there. It's still helping you out. Today we tested out the grill, but in the future I want to do the same video, but now taking things inside and pan searing, and I think that's where you really start seeing a huge difference. But if you don't have the time, you can still make a delicious steak without dry brining ahead of time, by just simply compensating at the end and using your finishing salt and pepper. Now, dry brining is definitely noticeable in other conditions. For example, when dry brining chicken, not only is it going to help you get that crispy skin that everybody wants, but it's also going to prevent the chicken from drying out. But that's sort of for another video. If you'd like me to make that video, leave me a comment below and we can save it for another time. And as always guys, if you found this video informative or entertaining, please consider liking and subscribing. I'd really appreciate it. I'll catch you in the next video.